The Winchester's barrel gleamed in the afternoon sun as Catherine Miller stepped onto her store's front porch. The weapon held steady in hands that had weighed flour and counted change for 15 years. 3 men sat their horses in the dust of Main Street, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, their intentions as clear as the badges they wore, badges that meant nothing in a territory where law was whatever a man could enforce with iron and lead. "Ma'am," the leader called, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "We're here to discuss your business arrangements. Seems you've been operating without proper protection." Catherine's finger found the trigger guard, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The only protection I need is right here in my hands." By sunset, 3 sets of spurs would lie cooling in the dust, and the territory of Nevada would learn that some women don't negotiate with wolves, no matter what badges they wear. But before we witness how one woman's courage changed everything, let me take you back to where it all began, in a place called Copper Ridge, where the nearest law was 100 miles away, and justice was whatever you could create with your own 2 hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach groaned to a halt outside Miller's General Store in a cloud of desert dust and exhausted horses, its arrival marking the only scheduled contact Copper Ridge had with the civilized world. Catherine Miller emerged from behind her counter, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she watched the driver climb down from his perch, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that traveled badly across the Nevada desert. "Mrs. Miller," Tom Harrison called, removing his hat. As he approached the store, "Got your supplies from Carson City, but I'm afraid I'm carrying more than merchandise this trip." Catherine had been expecting this conversation for weeks. Word traveled slowly across the vast emptiness of the Nevada territory, but it traveled nonetheless, carried by prospectors and drifters who spoke in hushed tones around campfires about a new kind of danger spreading across the frontier. Not Indians or wild animals or the harsh indifference of the desert, something worse. Men with badges who served no law but their own greed. "Tell me," she said simply, leading Tom into the relative coolness of the store's interior, where shelves lined with canned goods and dry supplies created narrow aisles that smelled of coffee beans and leather goods. Tom accepted the cup of coffee she offered, his hands shaking slightly as he warmed them around the tin cup. The October desert was unforgiving, scorching during the day, bitter cold once the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks that surrounded their isolated valley. "Started in Virginia City 3 months ago," Tom began, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper men used when discussing things that might get them killed. 3 men showed up wearing deputy badges, claimed they were territorial marshals sent to establish law and order, called themselves the Nevada Protection Association. Catherine settled into the chair across from him, her mind already calculating the implications. Copper Ridge sat at the intersection of 3 mining routes, a strategic location that made her store the lifeline for scattered prospectors and ranch families across 100 square miles of some of the most desolate country God had ever created. If trouble was coming, it would find them eventually. "Protection from what?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the beauty of their scheme," Tom said bitterly. "They create the very dangers they claim to protect against. Started with small thing supply wagons getting robbed, miners being jumped on lonely trails, ranches losing cattle to mysterious rustlers. Then these 3 angels show up, offering to solve everyone's problems for a reasonable monthly fee. The pattern was as old as civilization itself: create fear, then sell safety to the frightened. Catherine had seen variations of it in Missouri, before her husband Daniel's death had driven her west, seeking a place where a woman could build something with her own hands and defend it with her own will. "What happens to those who refuse their protection?" she asked, though the look in Tom's eyes already provided the answer. Jake Morrison ran the biggest saloon in Virginia City, Tom said quietly. Refused to pay, said he could handle his own problems. They found him 3 days later in an alley with his throat cut. His widow paid up the next morning. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach despite the desert heat. She'd known Jake Morrison, a good man who'd helped her establish credit with suppliers when she'd first opened the store. The kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, and who'd never back down from a fight in his life. They call themselves the Barrett brothers, Tom continued. Samuel, the leader, claims to be a territorial marshal, though nobody's seen official papers. His younger brothers, Matthew and Joshua, wear deputy badges and do most of the actual enforcement. They've got Story County locked down tight, every business, every mine, every ranch paying monthly tribute for the privilege of operating without interference. Catherine stood and walked to the store's front window, looking out at the handful of buildings that comprised Copper Ridge. The settlement had grown around her store, which had been the first permanent structure built when silver prospects in the nearby hills had drawn hopeful prospectors seeking their fortunes. Now it included a small boarding house run by widow Margaret Thompson, a blacksmith shop operated by former cavalry sergeant William Hayes, a saloon owned by Irish immigrant Patrick O'Sullivan, and perhaps a dozen scattered residences housing the families who decided this harsh but beautiful country was worth the risks it demanded. All of it dependent on the steady flow of supplies that came through her store. All of it vulnerable to men who understood that controlling the supply lines meant controlling everything else. How far behind you are they? Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the cold certainty settling over her thoughts. Tom's silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man delivering a death sentence. They left Virginia City 2 days after I did. Mrs. Miller said they had business to conduct in the outer settlements, wanted to expand their protection services to underserved communities. They'll be here tomorrow, maybe the day after. Catherine nodded, her mind already shifting from shock to calculation. She'd survived the cholera epidemic that killed her parents, the Civil War that claimed her first husband, and the brutal winters of her early years in Nevada when supplies ran short. And death was a constant companion. She'd learned that survival often came down to simple mathematics, what you could afford to lose versus what you couldn't afford to give up. The store represented 15 years of her life. Every board in its construction, every item on its shelves, every relationship with suppliers and customers had been built through her own labor and determination. Daniel's life insurance money had bought the initial inventory, but everything since then had come from her willingness to work 18-hour days, to extend credit to struggling families, to maintain fair prices when she could have charged whatever the market would bear. More than that, the store had become the heart of Copper Ridge's small community. It served as post office, meeting hall, and social center. Children received their first lessons in arithmetic by helping Catherine count inventory. Lonely prospectors found human conversation and hot meals. Families celebrated births and mourned deaths in the store's back room, which Catherine had always opened to anyone who needed a gathering place. The Barrett brothers might see it as just another business to be squeezed for monthly payments. Catherine saw it as the foundation of everything she'd built since Daniel's death. Not just her livelihood, but her purpose, her identity, and her contribution to something larger than herself. "What are you going to do?" Tom asked, reading the determination that had settled across her features like armor. Catherine walked to the gun cabinet behind her counter, where Daniel's Winchester rifle hung alongside the shotgun she'd learned to use during her first winter alone. Both weapons were clean, oiled, and loaded not from paranoia, but from the practical necessity of living in country where the nearest law enforcement was days away and help was whatever you could provide for yourself. "I'm going to run my store," she said simply, checking the Winchester's action with movements made smooth by years of practice. "Same as I have for 15 years. Same as I planned for 15 more. Tom set down his coffee cup, studying her with the concern of someone who'd seen what happened to people who stood against the Barrett brothers. Mrs. Miller, these aren't claim jumpers or drunken prospectors. These are organized men with a system. That's worked in every settlement they've touched. They don't take no for an answer. Then they've never met someone who doesn't know how to say yes, Catherine replied, returning the rifle to its rack. This is my land, my store, my community. I didn't come to Nevada to hand over what I've built to any man who shows up demanding tribute. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that made the harsh landscape briefly beautiful. Catherine had learned to love these moments, the daily transformation that reminded her why she'd chosen this difficult country over the comfortable certainties of civilization back east. Tom gathered his hat and prepared to leave, his face showing the mixture of admiration and concern that Catherine had grown accustomed to seeing in men who couldn't quite understand her refusal to accept limitations. You know you don't have to face this alone, he said. There are good people in this territory who'd stand with you if you asked. I know, Catherine said, walking him to the door. But this needs to start somewhere, with someone. Might as well be here with me. After Tom's departure, Catherine spent the evening reviewing her inventory, checking her accounts, and preparing for what she knew would be the most important negotiation of her life. Not because she intended to negotiate, she'd already decided that some things couldn't be bought or sold, but because she needed to understand exactly what she was defending and why it was worth the risk. The store's ledger books told the story of a community, built one transaction at a time. Credit extended to the Walsh family when Patrick lost his leg in a mining accident. Supplies donated to the Methodist Church for their annual harvest festival. Medicine provided at cost to elderly Mrs. Henderson when her arthritis made the winter unbearable. Countless small acts of generosity and community building that had transformed a collection of isolated individuals into something resembling a family. This was what the Barrett brothers wanted to tax, to control, to corrupt with their demands for protection money. They might think they were simply expanding their criminal enterprise into new territory, but Catherine understood they were attacking something far more valuable than a business. They were threatening the possibility that decent people could build decent communities even in the harsh emptiness of the frontier. As darkness settled over Copper Ridge, Catherine completed her preparations with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on careful attention to details others might overlook. She cleaned and loaded both the Winchester and the shotgun, checked her ammunition supplies, and arranged the store's layout to provide maximum defensive advantage if negotiations turned violent. Not because she wanted a fight, but because she'd learned that the best way to avoid violence was to be thoroughly prepared for it. Men like the Barrett brothers understood only strength, and strength required more than righteous anger. It demanded practical preparation and the will to see things through to whatever end they required. The last thing Catherine did before retiring to her small apartment above the store was to write a letter to her sister in Missouri, explaining her decision and the principles that had led to it. Not because she expected to die, she fully intended to survive whatever came next, but because she wanted someone to understand that her choice had been made from conviction, not stubbornness. Sarah, she wrote by lamplight, by the time you receive this, you'll have heard about the trouble that came to Copper Ridge. I want you to know that what I did not from anger or foolishness, but from the simple belief that some things are worth defending, no matter the cost. This store, this community, the idea that decent people can build decent lives, these things matter more than safety or compromise. If I don't stand for them, who will? She sealed the letter and placed it on her dresser, then settled into bed. With the Winchester within arm's reach, tomorrow would bring the Barrett brothers and their demands for tribute. It would also bring the first test of whether one woman's courage could stand against organized evil. whether principle could triumph over pragmatism, and whether a small community in the Nevada desert could choose justice over the easy path of submission. Catherine Miller fell asleep listening to the desert wind sing through the gaps in her store's wooden walls. Her last conscious thought a prayer not for safety, but for the strength to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. The Barrett brothers might believe they were coming to collect protection money from another frightened business owner. They had no way of knowing they were riding toward a confrontation that would test everything they thought they knew about power, fear, and the limits of what one determined woman would tolerate in defense of what she'd built with her own hands. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and by tomorrow's sunset, Copper Ridge would discover whether courage could triumph over corruption, or whether the Barrett brothers' reign of terror would claim another community for their criminal empire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Barrett brothers rode into Copper Ridge at precisely 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Their arrival timed with the calculated precision of men who understood that drama was as important as violence in establishing control. Samuel Barrett led the procession on a magnificent black stallion that had probably cost more than most settlers earned in a year, his silver badge catching the desert sun like a helograph signal announcing the arrival of authority, or at least what passed for authority in a territory where official papers were scarce and men's reputations traveled faster than their credentials. Catherine watched their approach from behind the store's front counter, her movements deliberate as she arranged merchandise that didn't need arranging. The Winchester leaned against the wall within easy reach, but she made no move toward it. Not yet. These men had perfected their system through careful psychology. They knew how to read fear, how to exploit desperation, how to transform reasonable people into compliant victims through the mere suggestion of consequences. But Catherine Miller had spent 15 years learning different lessons. She'd discovered that the desert taught harsh truths about survival, about the difference between flexibility and surrender, about when compromise became complicity. The Barrett brothers might have terrorized Virginia City and a dozen other settlements, but they'd never encountered a woman who measured her worth not by what she could keep, but by what she was willing to lose in defense of principle. Samuel Barrett dismounted with theatrical flourish, his spurs ringing against the wooden boardwalk as he approached the store's entrance. Behind him, his brothers maintained their mounted positions, Matthew scanning the surrounding buildings with the practiced eye of someone expecting trouble, Joshua keeping one hand resting casually on his pistol grip. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who'd performed this routine many times before, in many different towns, always with the same result. "Mrs. Miller, I presume," Samuel called as he entered the store, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of smile that might have charmed saloon girls and impressed territorial politicians, if not for the coldness that lurked behind his eyes like winter ice beneath spring water. "That's right," Catherine replied without looking up from her inventory sheets. "You'll be the Barrett brothers Tom Harrison mentioned. I assume you're here about the protection business." Samuel's smile widened at her directness. Most business owners required lengthy explanations, demonstrations of need, careful cultivation of fear before they understood their situation. Catherine's immediate recognition of the stakes suggested either unusual intelligence or dangerous preparation, both qualities that could complicate what should have been a simple negotiation. "Straight to business," Samuel said approvingly, settling his tall frame against the counter with casual authority. "I like that in a woman. Shows practical thinking. Yes, we're here to discuss security arrangements for your establishment and the broader Copper Ridge community." Catherine finally looked up from her papers, meeting his gaze with the steady composure of someone who'd faced down desert storms, claim jumpers, and the various emergencies that constituted normal life in frontier Nevada. Security from what? Exactly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both parties understood perfectly. Samuel's practiced speech about the increasing dangers of frontier life, the rise in banditry, the need for professional protection in lawless territories, all of it would sound reasonable to most ears, especially when delivered by a man wearing official badges and speaking with the authority of territorial law enforcement. Surely you've heard about the troubles plaguing isolated settlements. Samuel began, launching into his rehearsed presentation. Robbery, vandalism, violence against property owners who can't defend themselves adequately. The territorial government recognizes the need for enhanced security measures in remote areas where traditional law enforcement can't maintain regular presence. As he spoke, Catherine noticed Matthew Barrett positioning himself near the store's side entrance, while Joshua remained mounted outside the front door. Professional deployment, designed to control exits and prevent escape or outside interference. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic drifters. They were organized predators, with systematic methods and considerable experience in their chosen field. The Nevada Protection Association offers comprehensive security services, Samuel continued smoothly. Regular patrols, rapid response to threats, coordination with territorial authorities, and most importantly, the peace of mind that comes from knowing your business and community are under professional protection. Catherine listened with the patience of someone who'd learned to let her opponents reveal their entire hand before responding. Samuel's presentation was polished, authoritative, peppered with official-sounding terminology and references to territorial regulations that probably existed only in his imagination. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, outlining service packages and fee structures, response protocols and coverage areas, painting a picture of professional law enforcement, bringing order to the chaos of frontier life. When he finished, Catherine's response was delivered with the same calm practicality she might use to discuss the price of flour or the delivery schedule for winter supplies. Mr. Barrett, I appreciate your concern for our community's welfare, but I'm afraid we won't be requiring your services. The words landed like a physical blow. Samuel's smile flickered for just an instant before reasserting itself, but Catherine caught the flash of surprise, then calculation, that crossed his features. In all his experience terrorizing frontier communities, he'd never encountered such immediate, direct rejection of what most people recognized as an offer they couldn't refuse. Mrs. Miller, Samuel said, his tone shifting slightly towards something that might have been paternal concern. I don't think you fully understand the nature of the threats facing isolated communities like Copper Ridge. Perhaps we should discuss specific incidents that have occurred in similar settlements. Oh, I understand perfectly, Catherine interrupted, her voice cutting through his practiced persuasion like a blade through silk. You create problems, then sell solutions. You manufacture dangers, then offer protection from threats that wouldn't exist without your presence. It's an old game, Mr. Barrett, and not a particularly clever one. The temperature in the store seemed to drop several degrees. Samuel's mask of professional courtesy began to slip, revealing glimpses of the predator beneath the polished exterior. Outside, Matthew Barrett shifted position slightly, his hand moving closer to his weapon as he recognized the signs of negotiation failing. That's a serious accusation, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying new undertones of menace. The Nevada Protection Association operates under territorial authority, with full legal backing for our activities. Spreading false information about law enforcement officers could be considered a criminal act. Catherine moved slightly, positioning herself where she could reach the Winchester without telegraphing her intentions. The weapon leaned against the wall like a sleeping guardian, waiting for the moment when words would prove inadequate and more direct communication became necessary. "Show me your territorial commission," she said simply. The request caught Samuel off guard. Most frontier business owners were sufficiently intimidated by badges and official-sounding language that they never demanded to see actual credentials. The few who did ask for documentation were usually satisfied with forged papers or complicated explanations about classified assignments and confidential authorities. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "territorial commissions are sensitive documents not typically displayed for public inspection. Our authority derives from emergency powers granted during periods of civil unrest. In other words, you don't have one." The accusation hung between them like a loaded gun. Samuel's face darkened as he realized that his standard repertoire of intimidation techniques was proving ineffective against a woman who'd apparently done her own thinking about the relationship between authority and legitimacy. "What I have," Samuel said, abandoning all pretense of courtesy, "is the power to make life very difficult for people who refuse reasonable cooperation. Businesses that operate without proper protection tend to experience unfortunate incidents, fires, robberies, accidents that can be quite costly to recover from." Catherine smiled for the first time since the conversation began, but there was nothing warm or friendly in the expression. It was the smile of a woman who'd finally heard her opponent reveal his true nature, stripping away the pretense and getting down to the essential transaction he was proposing. "Now we're being honest," she said. "You're not law enforcement officers. You're not providing protection from existing threats. You're criminals running an extortion racket, and you're threatening to destroy my property if I don't pay tribute to your criminal organization." The words crackled through the store like electricity, making explicit what both parties had understood from the beginning, but neither had been willing to state directly. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol before stopping, not from conscience, but from tactical calculation. Killing Catherine Miller in broad daylight in her own store would create complications his operation couldn't afford, especially in a community small enough that every resident would know within hours exactly what had happened and why. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel said through gritted teeth, "you're making a very serious mistake. The Barrett brothers don't make idle threats, and we don't accept rejection of our services. Every business in our territory pays for protection, and yours won't be an exception." "My territory," Catherine corrected quietly. "This is my land. My store, my community. You're just visitors here, and unwelcome ones at that." Outside, she could hear the subtle sounds of the community beginning to take notice of the confrontation. Margaret Thompson had emerged from the boarding house and was sweeping her front porch with unusual vigor, her eyes fixed on the 3 mounted men who'd taken positions around the store. William Hayes had found urgent work in his blacksmith shop. That required him to stand in the doorway where he could observe the proceedings. Patrick O'Sullivan had discovered that his saloon's windows needed immediate cleaning, providing him with a perfect view of the developing situation. Copper Ridge might be isolated, but it wasn't defenseless. These people had survived in harsh country by learning to watch out for each other, to recognize threats to their community's survival, and to respond collectively to dangers that no individual could face alone. The Barrett brothers had chosen their target poorly. They'd expected to find a frightened woman operating a vulnerable business in an isolated location. Instead, they discovered the heart of a community that had learned to defend itself through mutual support and shared determination. "You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider your position," Samuel said, straightening his hat and preparing to leave. "Our standard protection fee for an establishment of this size is $50 per month, due in advance. That's quite reasonable considering the comprehensive services we provide." "And if I maintain my current position?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. Samuel's smile returned, but now it carried the cold promise of a man who'd found his threats ineffective and was prepared to move to more direct methods of persuasion. "Then you'll discover why every other business owner in our territory has found our services indispensable." He turned and walked toward the door, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor with each step. But before leaving, he paused and looked back at Catherine with the calculating expression of a predator sizing up particularly challenging prey. "Mrs. Miller, you seem like an intelligent woman. Surely you understand that $50 per month is a small price to pay for avoiding the kind of unfortunate incidents that plague unprotected businesses. Think carefully about what you're risking for the sake of stubborn pride." "Mr. Barrett," Catherine replied, her hand moving casually toward the Winchester stock, "you seem like an experienced criminal. Surely you understand that some things can't be bought, sold, or stolen. Think carefully about what you're risking for the sake of easy money." Samuel Barrett left the store without another word, but his expression promised that their conversation was far from over. Outside, his brothers fell into formation as they rode slowly through Copper Ridge's small business district, not departing, but conducting reconnaissance, studying the layout of buildings, noting defensive positions, identifying potential sources of resistance or support. Catherine watched them from her store window as they completed their survey of the community. They moved with the professional efficiency of men who'd performed similar assessments in other towns, gathering intelligence that would inform whatever action they decided to take next. This wasn't random violence or impulsive criminal behavior. It was systematic predation backed by careful planning and extensive experience. As the Barrett brothers disappeared into the desert heat shimmer that marked the edge of town, Catherine became aware that she was no longer alone in the store. Margaret Thompson had entered quietly during the final moments of the confrontation, followed by William Hayes, Patrick O'Sullivan, and several other community members who'd been drawn by the obvious tension of the meeting. "Catherine," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the concern of someone who'd witnessed enough frontier violence to recognize the signs of approaching trouble. "Those men aren't going to simply ride away and forget about us." "No," Catherine agreed, checking the Winchester's action with movements made automatic by years of practice. "They're not. Which means we need to decide what kind of community we want to be, one that pays tribute to criminals or one that stands up for itself." The decision that faced Copper Ridge was as old as civilization itself: submission or resistance, compromise or confrontation, the safety of capitulation versus the dangerous dignity of defiance. By tomorrow morning, they would learn whether a small community in the Nevada desert possessed the collective courage to face down organized criminals, or whether the Barrett brothers would add another settlement to their growing empire of fear and extortion. But as Catherine looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd chosen the harsh uncertainty of frontier life over the comfortable restrictions of civilization, she began to suspect that the Barrett brothers had made a fundamental miscalculation about the kind of community they'd chosen to threaten. The emergency meeting convened in the back room of Catherine's store as the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows across Copper Ridge's dusty Main Street. 12 adults crowded into the space normally reserved for inventory storage, their faces reflecting the grim determination of people who'd been forced to confront a choice they'd hoped never to face. Outside, the Barrett brothers had made camp just beyond rifle range, their cook fire sending smoke signals that spoke more clearly than words about their intentions to remain until business was concluded to their satisfaction. Margaret Thompson sat perched on a crate of canned goods, her weathered hands folded in her lap with the deceptive calm of a woman who'd buried 3 husbands and raised 4 sons in country that tested human endurance daily. At 62, she'd seen enough frontier violence to understand exactly what they were facing, and enough human nature to know that communities either stood together or fell separately when confronted by organized predation. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd served as unofficial leader for Copper Ridge's social organization since the community's founding. "We all heard enough of that conversation to understand our situation. The question before us is simple. Do we pay these criminals what they're demanding, or do we fight?" William Hayes spoke first, his massive frame filling the corner where he'd positioned himself near the room's single window. The former cavalry sergeant bore scars from Apache campaigns and Confederate bullets, marks of a man who'd learned warfare in the hardest school possible and understood both its costs and its necessities. "Fighting's not the question," Hayes said. "Bluntly, question is whether we fight smart or stupid. 3 experienced gunmen against a dozen civilians, those aren't odds any reasonable person would choose. But paying them isn't going to solve anything either. Men like the Barrett brothers don't take their money and disappear. They take it and come back for more, again and again, until they've sucked a community dry or destroyed it entirely." Patrick O'Sullivan nodded agreement from his position near the door, where his Irish accent carried the weight of someone who'd fled one form of oppression only to encounter another in the American West. "William's got the right of it. I've seen their kind before, back in County Cork and again in the mining camps. They're parasites, they are. Pay them once, and you'll be paying them forever, plus interest for the privilege." Young Dr. Sarah Bennett spoke up from her seat on a flour barrel, her medical bag positioned where she could reach it quickly if circumstances required emergency treatment. At 28, she was the newest resident of Copper Ridge, having arrived 6 months earlier when the Territorial Medical Board assigned her to serve the scattered communities of eastern Nevada. Her youth might have made some question her judgment, but her medical training had given her a clinical understanding of what violence could do to human bodies, knowledge that informed her perspective on their current crisis. "I've treated victims of protection rackets in Virginia City," Dr. Bennett said quietly. "The Barrett brothers don't limit their enforcement activities to property damage. They use physical intimidation, assault, and worse to ensure compliance. If we refuse their demands, people will get hurt, possibly killed." The sobering assessment settled over the room like funeral shroud. These weren't abstract discussions about principle and resistance. They were practical calculations about how much pain and risk the community was willing to accept in defense of their independence. Catherine had remained silent during the initial exchange, listening to her neighbors wrestle with the same questions that had kept her awake the previous night. Now she stood and moved to the room center, where her presence commanded attention not through dramatic gesture, but through the quiet authority she'd earned during 15 years of serving as the community's commercial and social anchor. "Dr. Bennett's right about the risks," Catherine said calmly. "The Barrett brothers will hurt people if we resist them. They'll damage property, intimidate families, and probably kill anyone they consider a particular threat to their operation. Those are the costs of standing up to them." She paused, letting the weight of those consequences settle over the room before continuing. "But there are also costs to submission. $50 per month might not sound like much to outsiders, but it represents a significant portion of what most of our businesses earn. More importantly, it establishes precedent. If we pay the Barrett brothers, we're announcing to every other criminal organization in the territory that Copper Ridge is easy prey. We'll face similar demands from other gangs, other corrupt officials, other predators who recognize a community that's learned to surrender rather than resist." Margaret Thompson spoke into the silence that followed Catherine's analysis. "What you're saying is that we're choosing between different kinds of destruction. Fight them, and they'll hurt us immediately. Pay them, and we'll be destroyed slowly by an endless parade of criminals who know we won't defend ourselves." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Catherine confirmed. "The only difference is whether we choose our destruction or let it choose us." The discussion that followed revealed the complex calculations that ordinary people face when confronted by organized evil. James Fletcher, who operated Copper Ridge's small lumber mill, pointed out that his business barely broke, even during good months. Adding $50 in monthly protection fees would force him to close or raise prices to levels that would drive away customers. Ana Rodriguez, whose family ran a small cattle operation, noted that paying protection money would require selling breeding stock they couldn't afford to lose, effectively destroying their herd's long-term viability. But other voices carried different concerns. Martha Steinberg, a widow with 3 young children, worried about exposing her family to violence for the sake of principle. Robert Chun, whose General Labor supported a wife and aging parents, questioned whether any amount of money was worth risking lives that couldn't be replaced. Their fears weren't cowardice, they were the rational calculations of people who understood that heroic gestures could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate participants. The debate continued for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling as neighbors who'd shared 15 years of frontier hardship found themselves divided by circumstances that tested their fundamental beliefs about community, responsibility, and the acceptable costs of maintaining dignity in an indifferent world. Finally, Catherine called for order by the simple expedient of walking to the room's center and speaking in a voice that carried absolute authority. "We're approaching this backward," she said. "We're discussing whether to fight the Barrett brothers as if it were a business decision, something we can analyze through profit and loss calculations. But that's not what this is about." She gestured toward the window, where the Barrett brothers' campfire continued sending smoke signals across the desert landscape. "Those men represent something more dangerous than financial loss or physical harm. They represent the idea that decent people can't build decent communities, that law means whatever armed men say it means, that right and wrong are determined by who's willing to use the most violence. If we accept their demands, we're not just paying money, we're accepting their version of how the world works." The passion in her voice was unmistakable, but it was passion grounded in practical understanding rather than abstract principle. Catherine had spent 15 years building something worthwhile in harsh country, and she understood exactly what was at stake. "Every community faces this choice eventually," she continued. "Do we believe that ordinary people can create extraordinary things, or do we accept that predators will always rule because they're willing to do what decent people won't do? Do we think children should grow up believing that evil wins because good people are too afraid to fight it?" Margaret Thompson was the first to speak after Catherine's speech, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched frontier communities rise and fall based on the collective character of their residents. "Catherine's right about the choice we're facing," Margaret said. "This isn't really about money or even safety. It's about what kind of people we want to be, what kind of community we want to build, what kind of example we want to set for our children." Hayes nodded agreement, his military experience informing his assessment of their tactical situation. "If we're going to fight, we need to fight smart. The Barrett brothers have experience and organization on their side, but we have advantages too. We know the terrain, we have defensive positions, and most importantly, we have something worth fighting for while they're just here for easy money." Dr. Bennett opened her medical bag and began checking supplies with the systematic thoroughness of someone preparing for casualties. "If violence is unavoidable, I'll need to prepare emergency treatment capabilities. We should also designate safe locations for non-combatants, especially families with children." The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, the community had shifted from debate to planning, from questioning the wisdom of resistance to organizing the practical details of defense. The decision to fight hadn't been made through formal vote or dramatic declaration. It had emerged through the collective recognition that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. O'Sullivan volunteered to coordinate with scattered ranch families who might provide additional fighters or serve as refuges for civilians during the confrontation. Fletcher offered his mill as a defensive position, noting that its elevated location provided clear sight lines across copper ridges. Approaches. Chun and Rodriguez agreed to evacuate non-essential residents to safe locations, while maintaining skeleton crews to operate essential services. But it was Margaret Thompson who raised the most important question: what happens after we fight them? Win or lose, word will spread that Copper Ridge resisted the Barrett brothers. That will either make us a symbol of successful resistance, or a cautionary tale about what happens to communities that refuse to pay protection money. Catherine had been thinking about the same question since Tom Harrison's warning about the Barrett brothers' approach. Their decision wouldn't affect only Copper Ridge, it would influence how other frontier communities responded to similar threats. Whether they found courage in Copper Ridge's example or learned submission from its destruction. Then we'd better make sure we win, Catherine said simply. And we'd better make sure other communities know that decent people can stand up to criminals and survive. As the meeting dispersed, community members departed to make their own preparations for what everyone understood would be the most dangerous night in Copper Ridge's history. Children were quietly relocated to the most defensible buildings, valuable property was secured or hidden, and weapons were cleaned and loaded with the grim efficiency of people who'd hoped never to need such skills, but had learned them nonetheless. Catherine remained in the store as darkness settled over the desert, watching the Barrett brothers' campfire flicker in the distance while checking her ammunition supply one final time. Tomorrow would test everything she'd built during 15 years in Nevada, not just her business, but her community, her principles, and her faith that ordinary people possessed the power to stand against extraordinary evil. The Barrett brothers probably assumed their ultimatum would produce the same result it had achieved in Virginia City and a dozen other settlements. They had no way of knowing they'd chosen to threaten a community that had already decided some things were worth dying for, and that tomorrow would determine whether courage could triumph over corruption in a place called Copper Ridge, where the nearest law was 100 miles away, and justice was whatever decent people were willing to create with their own hands. The first warning came at dawn when young Timothy Fletcher raced his horse into town with news that made every resident's blood run cold. The Barrett brothers hadn't waited for their morning deadline. They'd spent the night recruiting reinforcements from the network of drifters, claim jumpers, and displaced criminals who drifted through the Nevada territory like human tumbleweeds, always seeking opportunities for easy profit through violence. 8 more riders came into their camp around midnight. Timothy gasped, his 13-year-old voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. I was checking our north pasture like Pa told me, saw their fire get bigger, heard more horses. They're not just 3 men anymore, Mrs. Miller. They've got a whole gang now. Catherine accepted this intelligence with the grim composure of someone who'd always suspected their situation would deteriorate before it improved. 11 armed men against a scattered community of civilians changed the tactical equation dramatically, transforming what might have been a manageable confrontation into something approaching a massacre. But the news also confirmed what she'd begun to suspect about the Barrett brothers' operation. They weren't just 3 opportunistic criminals, but leaders of a larger criminal network with resources that extended far beyond their immediate presence. Timothy, she said calmly, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder, ride to the Fleming Ranch and warn them what's happening here. Tell your father I said to evacuate the outlying families to the old mining camp up Copper Canyon. It's defensible, has water, and it's far enough from town that they'll be safe whatever happens here. As Timothy departed on his second desperate ride of the morning, Catherine turned her attention to the defensive preparations that had consumed the community through the night. Hayes had positioned himself in the church bell tower with a rifle and enough ammunition for a prolonged siege. O'Sullivan had barricaded his saloon and created firing positions that covered the main street. Dr. Bennett had established a medical station in the schoolhouse basement, where she could treat wounded while remaining protected from stray bullets. But the reinforcements changed everything. 11 gunmen could surround the town, attack from multiple directions, and overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. What had seemed like a desperate but manageable stand now appeared to be a choice between submission and suicide. Margaret Thompson approached the store as Catherine was checking her weapons for the final time. her face bearing the exhausted determination of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. "Catherine," Margaret said quietly, "I've been thinking about our situation all night, and I believe we need to reconsider our decision." Catherine looked up from the Winchester, studying her neighbor's face with the careful attention of someone who understood that communities could fracture under pressure just as easily as they could unite in resistance. "Go on," Catherine said. "Simply, 8 more gunmen means we're not facing a protection racket anymore," Margaret continued. "We're facing a military operation. These men have resources, organization, and clearly more experience with violence than any of us possess. Fighting them isn't brave, it's suicidal, and suicide isn't justice, it's just waste." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Margaret Thompson wasn't advocating cowardice, she was making the rational argument that heroic gestures became meaningless when they achieved nothing but needless death. "What are you suggesting?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm suggesting we negotiate," Margaret said. "Not surrender, but negotiation. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation that allows us to maintain some independence, while acknowledging the reality of our situation." Catherine set down the rifle and walked to the store's front window, where she could see the Barrett brothers' expanded camp in the distance. Smoke from multiple fires indicated cooking for a substantial force, while the movement of men and horses suggested military-style organization rather than casual banditry. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were a coordinated force conducting what amounted to territorial conquest. "Margaret," Catherine said finally, "I understand your reasoning, and I can't argue with your assessment of our tactical situation. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing men with more experience in violence than we'll ever possess." She turned back to face her neighbor, her expression reflecting the weight of decisions that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the long-term character of their community. "But negotiation assumes that our opponents are reasonable men who can be satisfied through compromise. Everything we know about the Barrett brothers suggests they're predators who view any sign of weakness as invitation for increased demands. Today they want $50 per month. Next month, they'll want $100. Next year, they'll want ownership of everything we've built." Margaret's shoulders sagged as she recognized the truth in Catherine's analysis. "So what do you propose?" "That we fight 11 armed men in a battle we can't possibly win. I propose that we make them understand the real cost of what they're trying to take," Catherine replied. "They're counting on easy intimidation, quick submission, and minimal resistance. If we make their victory expensive enough, they might decide easier targets are available elsewhere." The strategy Catherine outlined wasn't about winning a military victory, it was about economic warfare, making the Barrett brothers' conquest of Copper Ridge cost more than it was worth. Every bullet they fired would need to be replaced. Every day they spent besieging the town was a day they couldn't spend extracting money from other communities. Every casualty they suffered would reduce their effectiveness in future operations. "They're businessmen," Catherine explained. "Criminal businessmen, but businessmen nonetheless. If we can make Copper Ridge unprofitable, they'll move on to easier opportunities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hayes, who'd climbed down from his bell tower position to report disturbing developments in the Barrett brothers' camp. "They're not preparing for assault," Hayes announced grimly. "They're preparing for siege, setting up permanent positions, organizing supply lines, establishing communications. These men know what they're doing, and they're planning for extended operations." The implications were sobering. A quick assault might have failed due to superior numbers, but it would have been over within hours. A siege could last weeks, slowly starving the community into submission while allowing the Barrett brothers to maintain their other criminal enterprises throughout the territory. "How long can we hold out?" Margaret asked, her question directed to the practical realities of food, water, and ammunition that would determine their endurance. Catherine had been calculating those same Resources since receiving Timothy's intelligence report. Food for 2 weeks if we're careful, longer if we ration strictly. Water indefinitely, the wells on our side of their perimeter. Ammunition depends on how much fighting they force on us. And morale? Hayes asked, raising the question that military commanders understood was often more important than material supplies. The question struck at the heart of their situation. Physical resources could be calculated and managed, but human endurance under extreme stress was far more difficult to predict. Communities had been known to collapse from internal pressure, even when external siege failed, as fear and desperation eroded the social bonds that held people together. That depends on whether people believe we're fighting for something worth the cost, Catherine said. If this becomes about my stubborn pride or abstract principles, morale will crumble quickly. If it remains about our right to build the kind of community we want, people will endure more than anyone expects. The test of that morale came sooner than expected. Around mid-morning, a white flag appeared at the edge of the Barrett brothers' camp, followed by Samuel Barrett himself, riding slowly toward the town center. He came alone and unarmed, a gesture of confidence that demonstrated his assessment of the power dynamics involved. Catherine met him in the street outside her store, the Winchester held casually but visibly in her hands. Behind her, she could sense the community watching from windows and doorways, their attention focused on a conversation that would determine whether resistance would continue or collapse under the weight of impossible odds. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel said with exaggerated courtesy as he dismounted, "I trust you've had time to reconsider our discussion from yesterday. Recent developments have somewhat altered the terms of our arrangement, have they?" Catherine replied. Neutrally, Samuel's smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone who believed victory was inevitable. "Indeed, our organization has grown overnight, as you've no doubt observed. What began as a simple business proposition has evolved into something more comprehensive. We're no longer discussing monthly protection fees, but rather a more permanent administrative arrangement." The euphemisms couldn't disguise the reality of what Samuel was proposing. The Barrett brothers weren't seeking tribute, they were announcing annexation, the complete absorption of Copper Ridge into their criminal empire. "The new terms are quite reasonable," Samuel continued. "We'll establish permanent security headquarters in your community, with oversight responsibilities for all commercial activities, property transfers, and civil disputes. Local residents will contribute a modest administrative fee, shall we say $100 per month per household, to support these expanded services." Catherine did the mathematics quickly. $100 per month represented more than most families earned in the same period. The Barrett brothers weren't seeking to tax the community, they were demanding its complete economic subjugation. "And if we decline these generous terms?" Catherine asked. Samuel's expression grew serious as he abandoned the pretense of negotiation. "Mrs. Miller, you're an intelligent woman. Surely you understand that declining is no longer an option. We have 11 men, superior weapons, and extensive experience in these matters. You have civilians with hunting rifles and romantic notions about frontier independence. The mathematics are quite clear." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "They are." What happened next would be discussed in frontier communities for decades afterward. Instead of submitting to the inevitable or making desperate last stands, Catherine Miller did something that no one, including Samuel Barrett, expected. She began to laugh. Not the hysterical laughter of someone broken by pressure, but the genuine amusement of someone who'd suddenly understood a joke that others had missed. Samuel's face showed confusion, then irritation, then genuine alarm as Catherine's laughter continued. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel said sharply, "I fail to see what's amusing about your situation." "Mr. Barrett," Catherine said when her laughter subsided, "you've made the same mistake that every predator makes when they encounter something they don't understand. You've assumed that because you're willing to use violence, everyone else must be afraid of it. She gestured toward the buildings around them, where the community continued watching from defensive positions. These people chose frontier life because they prefer uncertainty to security, challenge to comfort, the possibility of building something extraordinary to the guarantee of ordinary safety. You're threatening them with hardship, danger, and possible death, the same things they face every day just by living here. Samuel's confusion was evident. Most communities surrendered when faced with overwhelming force, recognizing the futility of resistance. Copper Ridge's continued defiance suggested either suicidal stupidity or something he'd failed to understand about the psychology of people who chose to build homes in the desert. What you still don't understand, Catherine continued, is that we're not fighting you because we think we can win. We're fighting you because losing to people like you would be worse than dying free. The conversation ended when Samuel Barrett realized he was dealing with something outside his experience, a community that had chosen principles over survival, meaning over safety, dignity over surrender. As he rode back toward his camp, his face showed the first signs of doubt about what should have been a simple criminal enterprise. Behind him, Copper Ridge prepared for siege with the grim determination of people who'd finally discovered what they were truly willing to die for. The first shot shattered the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:30 in the morning. A rifle bullet that splintered the wooden sign above Catherine's store and announced the beginning of what would become known throughout Nevada territory as the Battle of Copper Ridge. But this wasn't the coordinated assault that military tacticians might have expected. It was something far more insidious and psychologically devastating. The Barrett brothers had decided to break the community's will through a campaign of terror that would make surrender seem preferable to continued resistance. Dr. Sarah Bennett was awake when the siege began, having spent the night treating old Mrs. Kowalski's pneumonia in the improvised medical station she'd established in the schoolhouse basement. The single gunshot was followed by an eerie silence that stretched for nearly an hour, leaving defenders uncertain whether the attack had begun in earnest, or whether they'd heard only a warning shot designed to shatter nerves and sleep. The answer came with the sunrise, when the Barrett brothers revealed the true sophistication of their operation. Instead of frontal assault, they'd positioned sharpshooters at strategic points around Copper Ridge's perimeter, creating a network of overlapping fields of fire that made movement through the town streets deadly dangerous. Anyone who exposed themselves for more than a few seconds faced immediate rifle fire from hidden positions, not necessarily aimed to kill, but calculated to wound, terrorize, and gradually erode the community's ability to function. Catherine discovered the new reality when she attempted to move supplies from her store's loading dock to the schoolhouse medical station. The moment she appeared in the doorway, 3 rifles spoke simultaneously, their bullets striking the wooden frame inches from her head. She dropped to the floor and crawled back inside, her heart hammering as she realized the Barrett brothers had transformed Copper Ridge into a deadly maze where every movement carried potentially fatal consequences. Professional snipers, Hayes observed grimly from his position near the store's rear window. The former cavalry sergeant had recognized the tactical sophistication. Immediately, this wasn't random shooting by undisciplined criminals, but coordinated suppression fire by men who understood how to control territory through strategic intimidation. The psychological warfare escalated throughout the morning. The Barrett brothers had apparently studied the community's layout carefully during their reconnaissance, because their gunfire targeted specific locations designed to maximize fear and disruption. The schoolhouse bell tower, where Hayes had originally positioned himself, became impossible to occupy after repeated rifle shots made any exposure suicidal. The well that provided Copper Ridge's water supply came under intermittent fire that made drawing water a life-threatening endeavor requiring careful coordination and covering fire. Most devastating of all, the Barrett brothers had identified the locations where families with children had taken shelter, and they subjected these buildings to regular harassment that kept parents in constant terror for their children's safety. The bullets never penetrated the building's walls. The attackers were too skilled for such wasteful tactics, but the psychological impact was exactly what Samuel Barrett intended. Every shot reminded defenders that their resistance was endangering the most vulnerable members of their community. By noon, the true genius of the Barrett brothers' strategy had become apparent. They weren't trying to conquer Copper Ridge through military victory. They were demonstrating that continued resistance would make normal life impossible. Children couldn't play safely, adults couldn't work effectively, and the community couldn't function as long as the siege continued. The message was clear: surrender, or watch everything you've built slowly deteriorate under the constant threat of violence. The breaking point nearly came when 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez was grazed by a ricocheting bullet while playing in what her parents had thought was a safe area behind the boarding house. The wound was minor, barely more than a scratch, but the sight of blood on a child's arm sent shock waves through the defensive positions that threatened to shatter morale completely. Dr. Bennett treated the injury quickly and professionally, but as she cleaned and bandaged the small wound, she found herself questioning everything about their decision to resist. The child could have been killed, would be killed eventually if the siege continued. All of them could be killed, would be killed, if they persisted in defying men who possessed superior numbers, superior weapons, and superior experience in exactly this kind of warfare. "Catherine," Dr. Bennett said quietly when she'd finished treating Emma's wound, "we need to discuss the medical realities of our situation. I can treat minor injuries, set broken bones, even perform emergency surgery if necessary. But I can't resurrect the dead, and that's what we're facing if this continues." Catherine knelt beside Emma, who was being remarkably brave about her injury, but whose wide eyes reflected the kind of terror that no child should ever experience. The sight of fear in that innocent face hit Catherine harder than any bullet could have, forcing her to confront the human cost of her principles in the most immediate and personal terms possible. "How many?" Catherine asked quietly. Dr. Bennett understood the question immediately. "If they maintain this level of harassment, we'll start losing people within a week. Stress, accidents, ricochet wounds that turn septic. If they escalate to direct assault, half the community dies in the first hour." The mathematics of survival were brutal and undeniable. Catherine could maintain her principles, preserve her dignity, and defend her conception of what frontier communities should be, and in doing so, she could destroy everything and everyone she was trying to protect. But before she could respond to Dr. Bennett's assessment, Timothy Fletcher burst into the store through the rear entrance, his face flushed with excitement rather than fear. "Mrs. Miller," the boy gasped, "riders coming from the east." "A lot of them." Catherine felt her stomach drop. More reinforcements for the Barrett brothers would transform an already impossible situation into absolute catastrophe. But Timothy's expression suggested something different, something that didn't match the arrival of additional enemies. "How many?" Hayes demanded, moving to a window where he could observe the approaching dust cloud. "Maybe 20, Timothy replied breathlessly. "But Mrs. Miller, they're not coming to join the Barrett brothers, they're surrounding them." The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the store from despair to electric anticipation. Through gaps in the building's walls, they could hear shouting from the Barrett brothers' positions, the kind of panicked communication that suggested their enemies were facing an unexpected threat from an entirely unanticipated direction. Hayes grabbed a spyglass and positioned himself where he could observe the developing situation without exposing himself to sniper fire. What he saw through the lens made him smile for the first time since the siege began. "Federal marshals," he announced with grim satisfaction. 20 riders, all wearing badges, all carrying federal warrants. "Looks like someone's been tracking The Barrett brothers across the territory. The federal intervention had arrived at exactly the moment when Copper Ridge's resistance seemed destined to collapse under the weight of superior force and professional intimidation. But rather than providing immediate relief, the Marshals' presence created a three-way standoff that complicated the situation in entirely new ways. Catherine watched through a crack in the store's front wall as federal agents established positions that effectively surrounded the Barrett brothers' camp. The criminal gang found themselves trapped between the community they'd been besieging and federal law enforcement that apparently possessed warrants for their arrest. But 11 desperate men with nothing to lose represented a different kind of danger than the calculated intimidation they'd been conducting against civilians. Standoff stretched through the afternoon, with all three sides maintaining defensive positions while calculating their options. The federal marshals possessed legal authority and superior numbers, but they were reluctant to initiate a firefight that would endanger the civilians they'd come to protect. The Barrett brothers retained their tactical advantages in defensive positions, but they were now surrounded and cut off from escape routes. Copper Ridge remained caught in the middle, vulnerable to crossfire from any direction if shooting erupted. The resolution came in a form nobody anticipated. Rather than negotiating surrender or attempting escape, Samuel Barrett made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his fundamental miscalculation about the psychology of the people he'd been terrorizing. He decided to use Copper Ridge's civilians as human shields. The announcement came via shouted demands that carried clearly across the desert air. The Barrett brothers would release their siege of the community and surrender to federal authority, but only if the marshals provided them safe passage to the Mexican border. Any attempt to arrest them would result in the systematic execution of every civilian in Copper Ridge, beginning with the children and continuing until federal forces withdrew. The threat transformed the standoff from a law enforcement operation into a hostage crisis. Federal marshals possessed the legal authority to arrest the Barrett brothers, but they couldn't exercise that authority without condemning innocent people to death. Samuel Barrett had correctly calculated that federal agents would prioritize civilian safety over criminal apprehension, giving his gang leverage that might yet allow them to escape justice. But he'd failed to account for the character of the community he was threatening to massacre. Catherine Miller's response to the hostage threat would be remembered and repeated throughout frontier communities for decades afterward. Rather than cowering in terror or pleading for federal intervention, she emerged from her store into the dangerous open space of Copper Ridge's main street, walking with deliberate calm toward the center of town where her voice would carry to all three sides of the developing confrontation. "Mr. Barrett," she called, her voice steady despite the multiple rifles trained on her from different directions. "You seem to be under the impression that we're your prisoners. Allow me to clarify our actual relationship." What she said next shattered Samuel Barrett's hostage strategy and demonstrated why some communities couldn't be intimidated no matter how overwhelming the odds against them. "We're not your hostages," Catherine announced clearly. "We're your enemies. We chose to fight you knowing we might die. We're prepared to die rather than submit to your demands. And we absolutely refuse to be used as bargaining chips to help you escape justice." The declaration carried across the desert air like a battle cry, reaching federal marshals who suddenly understood they were dealing with a community that wouldn't accept protection purchased through compromise with evil. It reached the Barrett brothers, who realized their human shield strategy had collapsed because their intended shields had refused to cooperate with their own victimization. Most importantly, it reached the people of Copper Ridge, who discovered they possessed reserves of courage they hadn't known existed when someone finally articulated what they'd been feeling but couldn't express, that some things were worse than death, and that surrendering their dignity to save their lives was one of them. The siege of Copper Ridge was about to enter its final and most dangerous phase. But the psychological advantage had shifted decisively away from the Barrett brothers and toward a community that had finally learned the true cost of freedom and decided they were willing to pay it. Marshal Jacob Thornton had been tracking the Barrett brothers across 3 territories for 8 months, following a trail of corruption and violence that stretched from Colorado mining camps to California border towns. He'd seen communities destroyed by their protection racket, witnessed the aftermath of their systematic brutality, and documented evidence that would hang all 3 brothers if he could bring them to trial. But in 30 years of federal law enforcement, he'd never encountered anything like Catherine Miller's public rejection of victim status. Standing in his stirrups to observe the developing situation, Thornton could see the tactical nightmare that Copper Ridge represented. The Barrett gang occupied defensible positions with clear fields of fire. The civilian population was scattered throughout the danger zone, and any direct assault would likely result in massive casualties among the people he'd come to protect. Samuel Barrett's hostage strategy should have been devastatingly effective, except the hostages had just announced they refused to cooperate with their own rescue. "Marshal," Deputy Harrison called from his position 20 yards away. "What are your orders?" "The woman just eliminated our negotiating leverage." Thornton lowered his spyglass, considering options that ranged from difficult to impossible. Standard federal protocol called for containing the situation, establishing communication with the hostage-takers, and negotiating surrender through graduated pressure and incentives. But Catherine Miller had just destroyed that playbook by declaring her community's willingness to die rather than serve as Barrett's bargaining chips. "She didn't eliminate our leverage," Thornton said slowly, beginning to understand the psychological dynamics at work. "She eliminated theirs." The marshal's assessment proved accurate within minutes. Samuel Barrett's response to Catherine's declaration revealed a man whose carefully planned operation was unraveling in ways he'd never anticipated. Instead of rational calculation, his next actions showed the desperate fury of someone who'd built his entire criminal career on the assumption that fear would always triumph over principle. "Mrs. Miller," Barrett's voice carried across the desert air with barely controlled rage, "you're making a very serious mistake. My men have clear shots on your position. One word from me, and you're dead where you stand." Catherine remained motionless in the street's center, her figure small and apparently vulnerable against the backdrop of buildings that concealed multiple hidden gunmen. But her voice carried absolute conviction when she responded to Barrett's threat. "Then give that word, Mr. Barrett. Pull your triggers. Prove to everyone watching that your power depends on murdering unarmed women in broad daylight. Show these federal marshals exactly what kind of men they're dealing with." The challenge hung in the desert air like a thrown gauntlet. Samuel Barrett found himself trapped between equally unacceptable alternatives. Killing an unarmed woman would destroy any remaining pretense that his gang operated under legitimate authority, but failing to act on his threat would demonstrate that his power was illusory when confronted by someone who refused to be intimidated. From his concealed position, Marshal Thornton watched the confrontation with growing admiration for Catherine's tactical brilliance. She'd identified Barrett's fundamental weakness, his need to maintain the fiction that he represented legitimate law enforcement rather than criminal predation. By forcing him to choose between obvious murder and acknowledged impotence, she'd created a psychological trap that would destroy his authority regardless of which option he selected. The standoff stretched for long minutes while Barrett wrestled with a decision that would define the remainder of his criminal career. His reputation throughout the territory depended on the belief that opposition to his demands resulted in swift and decisive retaliation. But Catherine Miller had positioned herself where retaliation would be witnessed by federal agents, documented in official reports, and used as evidence in territorial courts that might finally bring him to justice. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Matthew Barrett, the youngest and most volatile of the 3 brothers, had apparently reached the limit of his patience with psychological warfare and tactical considerations. His rifle shot shattered the tense silence, the bullet striking the ground mere inches from Catherine's feet and sending up a spray of dust that coated her dress with Nevada desert. "Next one goes through your heart, lady," Matthew shouted, his voice carrying the kind of unhinged fury that suggested a man whose nerves had been stretched beyond their breaking point. "You want to play hero? Let's see how heroic you feel when you're bleeding in the dirt." But instead of terrorizing Catherine into submission, Matthew's near miss accomplished something that no amount of federal intervention could have achieved. It galvanized Copper Ridge's scattered defenders into unified action. The sound of that rifle shot was answered by gunfire from a dozen different positions as the community's civilians abandoned their hiding places and began shooting back with the concentrated fury of people who'd finally seen enough. William Hayes opened fire from the church bell tower, his military training evident in the methodical precision with which he began targeting the Barrett brothers' concealed positions. Patrick O'Sullivan emerged from his barricaded saloon with a shotgun that spoke like thunder, laying down covering fire that allowed other defenders to reach better positions. Even Dr. Bennett abandoned her medical neutrality, producing a small pistol that she used with surprising accuracy to discourage Barrett gang members who'd exposed themselves while returning fire. The Battle of Copper Ridge had begun in earnest, and it immediately became clear that the Barrett brothers had fundamentally miscalculated the kind of opposition they'd be facing. These weren't terrified civilians cowering in their homes. They were frontier residents who'd chosen difficult country because they preferred independence to security, challenge to comfort, and the possibility of building something extraordinary. To the guarantee of ordinary safety, Marshal Thornton seized the opportunity created by the community's uprising, leading his federal agents in a coordinated assault on the Barrett brothers' positions while their attention was focused on the unexpected civilian resistance. But the urban combat that followed proved more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated, as three separate armed groups maneuvered through Copper Ridge's narrow streets while trying to avoid hitting each other in the crossfire. The fighting raged for over an hour, transforming the quiet desert settlement into a battlefield, where every building became a fortress and every alley became a potential killing ground. The Barrett gang fought with the desperate efficiency of men who understood that capture meant hanging, while federal agents pressed their attack with the methodical professionalism of law enforcement officers conducting a sanctioned operation. Caught between them, Copper Ridge's defenders fought with the fierce determination of people protecting their homes, their community, and their vision of what frontier life could become. Catherine had taken cover behind a water trough after Matthew Barrett's near miss, but she continued coordinating the community's defense through shouted instructions that helped civilians avoid federal agents' lines of fire while maintaining pressure on the criminal gang's positions. Her store, the focal point of Copper Ridge's commercial and social life, became an impromptu command post where ammunition was distributed, wounded were treated, and tactical decisions were made in the chaos of urban warfare. The turning point came when Joshua Barrett, attempting to escape the tightening federal cordon, made the mistake of breaking cover near the schoolhouse where several families had taken shelter with their children. Hayes, observing from his elevated position, saw the armed man approaching the building where the community's most vulnerable members had sought protection. The former cavalry sergeant's shot was perfect. A single bullet that dropped Joshua Barrett before he could threaten the civilians he'd been approaching. But more importantly, the successful elimination of one of the gang's leaders demonstrated that the Barrett brothers weren't invincible, that their reign of terror could be ended by ordinary people who possessed sufficient courage and determination. Samuel Barrett's reaction to his brother's death revealed the true character beneath his polished exterior. Abandoning all pretense of legitimate authority, he began screaming orders that showed his operation's criminal nature in the starkest possible terms. His remaining men were instructed to burn civilian buildings, execute prisoners, and create as much destruction as possible before their inevitable capture or death. But the Barrett gang's attempted scorched earth campaign failed because they'd already lost the initiative to federal agents and civilian defenders who'd learned to coordinate their efforts. Every attempt to set fires was met by immediate suppression from multiple directions. Every move toward civilian targets was blocked by overlapping fields of fire from defenders who'd positioned themselves to protect the community's most vulnerable members. Marshal Thornton's final assault came just as the afternoon sun began casting long shadows across Copper Ridge's battle-scarred streets. Leading a coordinated advance by federal agents who'd surrounded the remaining Barrett positions, Thornton called for surrender with the authority of someone who possessed overwhelming tactical advantage and legal jurisdiction to end the confrontation on his terms. Samuel Barrett, the marshal's voice carried clearly across the settlement. You're surrounded by federal agents with warrants for your arrest on charges of murder, extortion, and conspiracy. Your brother Joshua is dead, your men are outnumbered, and continued resistance will only add to the charges against you. Surrender now, and you'll receive fair trial under territorial law. The offer was more generous than Barrett deserved, considering the trail of violence and corruption he'd left across 3 territories. But Thornton understood that federal law enforcement depended on maintaining the appearance of justice, even when dealing with obvious criminals. And a public surrender would provide better precedent than a final firefight that could be interpreted as federal overreach. Samuel Barrett's response revealed a man whose carefully constructed empire had collapsed in the span of a few hours, leaving him facing the prospect of hanging for crimes that had seemed safely beyond legal consequences just that morning. What guarantee do I have of fair treatment? Barrett called, his voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier demands. The same guarantee every American citizen receives under territorial law, Thornton replied. Trial by jury, legal representation, and judgment based on evidence presented in open court. The negotiation that followed lasted nearly 30 minutes, with Barrett attempting to extract concessions that might save his life while Thornton insisted that surrender must be unconditional. But the outcome was inevitable, surrounded, outnumbered, and facing opponents who demonstrated their willingness to fight to the death. The remaining Barrett gang members had no choice but to accept federal custody and hope that territorial courts might prove more merciful than the desert justice they'd been imposing on frontier communities. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, casting the bullet-scarred buildings in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine Miller stood in the doorway of her store watching federal agents place the Barrett brothers in chains. The siege was over, the criminals were captured, and the community had survived its greatest test. But the real victory wasn't military. It was the demonstration that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and prevail through courage, determination, and the willingness to risk everything in defense of their principles. The territorial courthouse in Carson City had never hosted a trial that generated such widespread attention throughout the American West. For 3 weeks, journalists from newspapers as distant as San Francisco and Denver had filled the gallery, documenting every detail of what legal scholars were already calling the most significant criminal case in Nevada Territory's brief history. The Barrett brothers' prosecution represented more than simple justice for their crimes. It was a test of whether territorial law could function effectively in regions where federal authority remained tenuous and local corruption had flourished. Unchecked, Catherine Miller sat in the witness chair for the second day, her testimony methodically dissecting the criminal organization's methods with the precision of someone who documented their activities from the victim's perspective. Defense attorney Marcus Caldwell, imported from San Francisco specifically to represent the Barrett brothers, had spent hours attempting to discredit her account, suggesting that a woman's emotional response to business negotiations might have distorted her perception of legitimate law enforcement activities. "Mrs. Miller," Caldwell said with the patronizing tone that successful lawyers often employed when cross-examining female witnesses, "isn't it possible that your interpretation of the Barrett brothers' visit was influenced by hysteria common to women facing unfamiliar business pressures?" The question revealed Caldwell's fundamental miscalculation about both Catherine's character and the jury's intelligence. These were Western men who'd witnessed frontier women managing businesses, defending homesteads, and making life-or-death decisions with competence that often exceeded their male counterparts. The suggestion that Catherine might have misunderstood simple extortion due to feminine weakness struck them as both insulting and obviously false. "Mr. Caldwell," Catherine replied with the calm precision that had characterized her entire testimony, "when armed men inform a business owner that unfortunate accidents happen to establishments without proper protection, most women are intelligent enough to recognize a threat. Perhaps Eastern attorneys require more explicit language to understand criminal intent." The gallery's muffled laughter drew a sharp rebuke from Judge Harrison Blackwood, but the damage to Caldwell's credibility was already done. His strategy of portraying Catherine as an unreliable witness had backfired spectacularly, transforming her into a sympathetic figure whose obvious competence made the Barrett brothers' crimes appear even more heinous. Prosecutor James Whitman had built his case methodically over 2 weeks, presenting evidence that revealed the full scope of the Barrett criminal organization. Federal investigators had traced their activities across 6 territories, documenting a pattern of extortion, murder, and corruption that had claimed dozens of lives and destroyed numerous communities. Bank records showed systematic theft of territorial funds, while testimony from surviving victims painted a picture of organized predation that operated under the false authority of law enforcement badges. But the prosecution's most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source, Matthew Barrett himself, who'd agreed to testify against his brothers in exchange for a life sentence rather than hanging. His detailed confession revealed operational methods, identified additional gang members, and provided insights into the psychological techniques the organization used to terrorize communities into submission. Samuel always said the key was making people believe resistance was hopeless, Matthew testified, his voice barely audible as he described his brother's criminal philosophy. He studied military tactics, read books about siege warfare, learned how to break civilian morale without wasting ammunition on actual killing. Fear was cheaper than bullets and just as effective. The confession continued for hours, with Matthew Barrett describing specific murders, detailing financial arrangements with corrupt territorial officials, and explaining the systematic methods his gang had developed for identifying vulnerable communities. His testimony was damning not just for its specific revelations, but for its clinical demonstration of how organized criminals could exploit gaps in territorial law enforcement to create zones of lawlessness where they operated with virtual impunity. Samuel Barrett maintained his innocence throughout the trial, presenting himself as a legitimate law enforcement officer whose methods might have been unorthodox but whose intentions had been directed toward maintaining order in lawless territories. His testimony was polished, articulate, and completely undermined by the mountain of physical evidence, witness testimony, and his brother's detailed confession. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Samuel said during his final statement, "I devoted my life to bringing civilization to the frontier. If my methods were sometimes harsh, they were necessitated by the harsh realities of territorial life. I am not a criminal, I am a peace officer who made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of extortion, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of impersonating federal officers, and guilty of theft of territorial funds. Judge Blackwood's sentencing was swift and uncompromising. Samuel and Matthew Barrett would hang within 30 days, while the surviving gang members would serve life sentences at territorial prison, but the trial's conclusion represented only the beginning of changes that would transform frontier law enforcement throughout the American West. Catherine's testimony had been distributed to newspapers nationwide, inspiring similar investigations in territories where protection rackets had operated without challenge. Federal authorities used evidence gathered during the Barrett prosecution to identify and arrest corrupt officials across multiple jurisdictions, while territorial governments implemented new oversight systems designed to prevent similar criminal organizations from establishing themselves. The personal cost of victory became apparent during Catherine's journey back to Copper Ridge. The 3 weeks in Carson City had given her time to process the trauma of the siege, to understand the full implications of what they'd survived, and to recognize how close they'd come to complete destruction. The Barrett brothers might have been defeated and brought to justice, but their campaign of terror had left scars that would take years to heal. Dr. Sarah Bennett met Catherine at the Stagecoach Depot with news that was both encouraging and sobering. The community had begun rebuilding with remarkable resilience, repairing bullet damage and returning to normal commercial activities. But several families had decided that Copper Ridge's isolation made it too vulnerable to future threats, and they'd relocated to larger settlements where federal law enforcement maintained regular presence. "We lost about a quarter of our population," Dr. Bennett reported as they rode toward town. The Kowalski family moved to Virginia City, the Hendersons went back east to relatives in Missouri, and 3 of the single miners decided to try their luck in California. "Can't say I blame them. What we went through would test anyone's nerve." Catherine absorbed this information with mixed emotions. She understood why families with children might seek the security of larger communities, but each departure represented a piece of the social fabric they'd fought so hard to protect. Building a frontier community required more than defeating external threats. It demanded the patience to rebuild after each crisis, the faith to continue investing in an uncertain future, and the wisdom to learn from surviving experiences that might have destroyed weaker societies. The changes in Copper Ridge became apparent the moment Catherine's stagecoach crested the hill overlooking the settlement. Construction was underway on several new buildings, including what appeared to be a substantial structure near the town center. More telling were the defensive modifications that had been added to existing buildings: reinforced doors, barricaded windows, and strategic positions that would allow better coordination if future threats materialized. "We learned some lessons," William Hayes explained that evening as the community gathered in Catherine's store to welcome her home. "Not just about fighting, but about preparing for fights before they happen. The Barrett brothers taught us that isolation makes us vulnerable, but it also makes us self-reliant in ways that larger communities can't match." The new building, Catherine discovered, would serve as Copper Ridge's first official courthouse and marshal's office. Territorial authorities had agreed to establish a permanent law enforcement presence in response to the community's demonstrated ability to defend itself and maintain order. The assignment would rotate among federal deputies, ensuring that Copper Ridge never again faced criminal threats without immediate access to legitimate law enforcement support. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological rather than physical. The siege had revealed capabilities and character traits that residents hadn't known they possessed, transforming a collection of individuals into a genuine community united by shared trials and mutual dependence. Children who'd cowered in basements during the firefight now played games that recreated their parents' heroic defense of the settlement. Adults who'd never fired weapons in anger now practiced regularly, understanding that their community's security depended on every resident's readiness to defend what they'd built together. "We're different now," Margaret Thompson observed during Catherine's first evening back. "Before the Barrett brothers, we were just people who happened to live in the same place. Now we're people who chose to fight for the same principles. That's not something you can take away, no matter what future challenges we face." The observation captured something essential about how extreme circumstances could transform human relationships. The siege had tested every assumption about courage, community, and individual responsibility, revealing that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities when fighting for something they truly valued. More importantly, it had demonstrated that frontier communities could choose their own character. They could submit to predators like the Barrett brothers, or they could resist regardless of cost. Catherine's store gradually returned to its normal function as the community's commercial and social center. But conversations now included regular discussions about security, territorial politics, and the broader implications of their successful resistance. Word of Copper Ridge's victory had spread throughout Nevada territory, inspiring other communities to resist protection rackets and encouraging federal authorities to take more aggressive action against organized criminal activity. The Barrett brothers' execution took place on a cold November morning, witnessed by federal officials, victims' family members, and journalists who documented the end of one of the territory's most notorious criminal organizations. Samuel Barrett's final statement was brief and unrepentant, maintaining his innocence even as the noose was placed around his neck. His death marked the conclusion of a criminal career that had terrorized frontier communities for years. But more importantly, it demonstrated that territorial justice could function effectively when communities possessed the courage to demand accountability from those who claimed authority over them. As winter settled over Copper Ridge, Catherine found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had transformed a simple business dispute into a test of everything she believed about frontier life, individual responsibility, and the possibility that decent people could build decent communities even in the harshest circumstances. The Barrett brothers had intended to add her store to their criminal empire, extracting tribute that would have slowly destroyed everything she'd built over 15 years. Instead, their defeat had proven that some things couldn't be bought, sold, or stolen, that courage was contagious when someone finally demonstrated it, that communities could choose principle over safety, and that ordinary people possessed the power to stand against extraordinary evil when they finally decided that submission was worse than death. 5 years after the Barrett brothers' execution, Catherine Miller received a letter that would forever change her understanding of how individual courage could create consequences extending far beyond the immediate circumstances that inspired it. The envelope bore the official seal of the Wyoming Territory government, but the handwritten note inside came from someone whose name she didn't recognize, a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell who'd apparently heard about Copper Ridge's successful resistance through newspaper accounts that had circulated throughout the frontier. Mrs. Miller, the letter began in precise handwriting that suggested education and determination. I am writing to thank you for something you probably don't realize you did. Your stand against the Barrett brothers inspired my community to resist a similar criminal organization that had been terrorizing our county for 2 years. When they demanded protection money from my family's trading post, I remembered reading about a woman in Nevada who chose to fight rather than submit. That memory gave me the courage to organize resistance that ultimately led to the criminals' capture and prosecution. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing how news of Copper Ridge's victory had spread through frontier communities like seeds carried by desert winds, taking root in places where other ordinary people faced similar choices between submission and resistance. Elizabeth Hartwell's trading post in Wyoming had become the focal point for a community that decided to follow Catherine's example, organizing collective defense against criminals who'd assumed that isolated settlements would always choose safety over principle. But Mrs. Hartwell's letter was only the first of many. Over the following months, Catherine received correspondence from across the American West, from Texas ranchers who'd driven off cattle rustlers, from Colorado miners who'd exposed corrupt territorial officials, from California farmers who'd organized against land speculators using intimidation tactics similar to the Barrett brothers' methods. Each letter described communities that had found inspiration in Copper Ridge's example, proving that individual acts of courage could inspire collective action across vast distances and diverse circumstances. The phenomenon caught the attention of territorial governments, federal authorities, and Eastern newspapers that began referring to the Copper Ridge Effect, the tendency for successful resistance against frontier crime to inspire similar resistance in other communities. Academic researchers traveled west to study how news of Catherine's stand had influenced territorial law enforcement, while politicians debated whether individual heroism could provide practical models for broader social change. But the most significant consequence of Copper Ridge's victory wasn't academic or political. It was the gradual transformation of how frontier communities understood their relationship with both criminal predation and legitimate authority. Before the Barrett brothers' defeat, isolated settlements had generally assumed that protection from organized crime required either submission to criminal demands or reliance on distant federal law enforcement that might arrive too late to prevent disaster. Catherine's successful resistance had demonstrated a third option. Communities could organize their own defense, document criminal activity, and coordinate with legitimate authorities to ensure that justice prevailed through collective action rather than individual heroism or external intervention. This model spread throughout the frontier, creating networks of mutual support that made protection rackets far more difficult to establish and maintain. The changes were visible during Catherine's travels to purchase supplies and coordinate with other merchants throughout Nevada territory. Carson City had established a Frontier Defense Commission that provided training, equipment, and coordination services for isolated communities facing criminal threats. Virginia City had created a territorial intelligence network that shared information about gang movements, criminal recruitment, and emerging threats across multiple counties. Even small settlements like Copper Ridge had gained access to telegraph communications that allowed immediate coordination with federal authorities when dangerous situations developed. More importantly, the legal precedents established during the Barrett brothers' trial had created new tools for prosecuting organized crime throughout the frontier. Federal courts now recognize community resistance as evidence of criminal intent, while territorial governors possessed enhanced authority to intervene in local situations where corruption had compromised normal law enforcement. The systematic documentation methods Catherine had developed were being taught to territorial officials as standard procedures for building criminal cases that could withstand legal challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal rather than institutional. Catherine discovered that her reputation as someone who'd stood against impossible odds had made her a symbol for women throughout the frontier who faced their own challenges with limited authority, resources, or social support. The letters she received weren't all about criminal resistance. Many came from women who'd found courage to leave abusive marriages, start independent businesses, or challenge social conventions that limited their opportunities for meaningful participation in frontier society. Your example showed me that being afraid doesn't mean being powerless, wrote Sarah McBride from a small town in Colorado. When my husband tried to sell our homestead without my consent, I remembered reading about a woman who chose to fight rather than accept what seemed inevitable. I hired a lawyer, challenged the sale in territorial court, and won the right to maintain our property independently. None of that would have happened without the inspiration of your story. The correspondence revealed how Catherine's resistance to the Barrett brothers had become something larger than a single community's successful defense against criminal extortion. It had evolved into a demonstration that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they finally decided that some things were worth defending regardless of cost, risk, or probability of success. This broader influence became apparent during Catherine's invitation to address the first Western Territories Law Enforcement Conference in Denver, where federal marshals, territorial officials, and community leaders gathered to discuss improved coordination against organized criminal activity. Her speech, delivered to an audience of over 200 law enforcement professionals, provided the victim's perspective on criminal tactics and community response strategies that had proven effective in real-world situations. The Barrett brothers succeeded for years because they understood something that law enforcement often overlooks, Catherine told the assembled officials. They knew that fear could be more powerful than violence, that the threat of consequences could be more effective than actual consequences, and that isolated communities would surrender to avoid confrontation rather than risk everything in defense of abstract principles. Her analysis of criminal psychology proved invaluable to federal agents who'd been tracking similar organizations throughout the frontier. The Barrett brothers' methods, systematic intimidation, false authority, graduated escalation of threats, had been replicated by criminal gangs across multiple territories, suggesting coordination and communication that federal law enforcement was only beginning to understand. But they also made a crucial miscalculation, Catherine continued. They assumed that all communities would respond to pressure the same way, that fear would always triumph over principle, and that ordinary people would never choose uncertain resistance over guaranteed submission. They were wrong about Copper Ridge, and they're wrong about dozens of other communities that have learned from our example. The conference led to the establishment of the Frontier Community Defense Program, a federal initiative that provided training, equipment, and coordination support for isolated settlements that might face organized criminal threats. Catherine was offered the position of director, a role that would have required relocating to Denver and coordinating defense efforts throughout the Western Territories. She declined the offer, choosing instead to remain in Copper Ridge while serving as a consultant who could provide guidance based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Her decision reflected a fundamental understanding that her effectiveness derived not from official authority or institutional position, but from her credibility as someone who actually faced the challenges she was advising others to confront. Decline also allowed Catherine to witness the long-term transformation of her own community, which had evolved from a collection of isolated individuals into something approaching a model for frontier democratic governance. The siege's aftermath had required collective decision-making about reconstruction, security, and future development that had created formal institutions where none had existed before. Copper Ridge now held regular town meetings where residents discussed community issues, allocated resources for public projects, and made decisions about how to balance individual freedom with collective security. The courthouse that had been built after the siege served not just as a federal outpost, but as a center for local governance that demonstrated how frontier communities could create democratic institutions without waiting for external authority to impose them. The changes were most visible in the next generation. Children who'd hidden in basements during the Barrett brothers' siege had grown into teenagers who understood both the costs and the possibilities of community self-defense. They practiced marksmanship not from paranoia, but from practical recognition that security required capability. They studied territorial law not as abstract academic subject, but as practical knowledge necessary for participating in democratic governance. Most importantly, they'd internalized the lesson that individual courage could inspire collective action, that ordinary people possessed the power to stand against extraordinary evil, and that communities could choose their own character through the accumulated decisions of residents who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and periodic sacrifice. Catherine's store remained the center of Copper Ridge's commercial and social life, but it had also become something like a shrine for visitors who wanted to see where one woman's refusal to pay protection money had inspired a transformation that extended across the American frontier. The bullet holes from the siege had been preserved rather than repaired, serving as reminders of what they'd survived and what they'd proved possible through collective courage. As she prepared for that on the 5th anniversary of the Barrett brothers' defeat, Catherine reflected on the strange journey that had begun with 3 criminals demanding $50 per month and had evolved into a demonstration that individual acts of principle could create consequences extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. She'd chosen to resist not because she expected to inspire others, but because submission seemed worse than death. Instead, her survival had proven that courage was contagious, that communities could choose principle over safety, and that ordinary people possessed the power to create extraordinary change when they finally decided that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. The Barrett brothers had intended to destroy what she'd built. Instead, their defeat had helped build something far larger, a network of frontier communities that had learned to stand together against any force that threatened their vision of what American democracy could become in the vast spaces of the Western Territories. 20-5 years after the Barrett brothers rode into Copper Ridge, demanding protection money, Catherine Miller stood on the platform of the newly completed railroad depot, watching as the morning train from San Francisco discharged passengers who would have been unimaginable during the frontier's harsh early decades. Among them were Eastern investors drawn by stories of Nevada's transformation, territorial officials conducting routine business that no longer required armed escorts, and families seeking opportunities in communities that had evolved from dangerous outposts into thriving centers of commerce and civilization. The railroad's arrival represented more than improved transportation. It symbolized the complete transformation of a region that had once existed beyond the reach of law, order, and economic development. Where scattered settlements had once survived in isolation, connected only by dangerous trails and irregular supply runs, a network of prosperous communities now enjoyed daily communication, regular commerce, and immediate access to federal authority that could respond to threats within hours rather than weeks. Catherine, now 62 and recognized throughout the West as a founding figure in frontier community development, had been invited to speak at the depot's dedication ceremony. Her address would mark not just the completion of a transportation project, but the symbolic end of the frontier era that had defined Nevada territory for over 2 decades. The train's arrival meant that Copper Ridge would never again face the kind of isolation that had made the Barrett brothers' protection racket possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd that included territorial officials, railroad executives, and residents from communities throughout eastern Nevada. 25 years ago, this region was governed by a simple principle: might made right. Men with guns determined law. Justice meant whatever served the interests of whoever held power. And ordinary people had 2 choices: submit to predators or die resisting them. The audience included many who remembered those harsh realities. Personally, Governor Samuel Crawford had been a territorial judge who'd witnessed communities destroyed by criminal organizations similar to the Barrett brothers. Railroad President Michael O'Connor had lost family members to frontier violence during his early surveying expeditions. Even the youngest adults present had grown up hearing stories about the dangers that had characterized Nevada's early territorial period. Today, we celebrate not just the completion of a railroad, but the triumph of a different principle, Catherine continued. We've proven that ordinary people can build extraordinary communities, that law can serve justice rather than power, and that civilization isn't something imposed by distant authorities. It's something created by local residents who decide that their children deserve better than what they inherited. The transformation Catherine described was visible everywhere around the depot. Copper Ridge now boasted over 500 residents, with substantial commercial buildings, a territorial courthouse that handled legal matters for the entire county, and educational institutions that attracted students from across Nevada territory. The original general store remained at the community's heart, but it was now part of a business district that included banks, hotels, professional offices, and manufacturing facilities that served markets extending to California and Colorado. More significantly, the democratic institutions that had emerged from the Barrett brothers' siege had evolved into a model of territorial governance that was being studied and replicated throughout the American West. Copper Ridge's town council operated under a charter that balanced individual rights with collective security, maintained transparent financial management, and provided mechanisms for citizen participation that ensured local government remained accountable to the people it served. The success had attracted attention from the highest levels of American government. President Harrison himself had visited Copper Ridge during his Western tour, praising the community as an example of how frontier settlements could develop stable, democratic institutions without sacrificing the independence and self-reliance that characterized Western American culture. Congressional leaders cited Copper Ridge's evolution when debating statehood requirements for Western territories, arguing that communities capable of self-governance deserved recognition as full participants in American democracy. But Catherine's most meaningful achievement wasn't institutional or political. It was the network of relationships that had grown from her correspondence with communities throughout the frontier. The letters that had begun arriving after the Barrett brothers' defeat had evolved into a systematic exchange of information, resources, and mutual support that connected isolated settlements across thousands of miles of challenging territory. The Copper Ridge model, as territorial officials had begun calling it, provided practical guidance for community organization, criminal resistance, and democratic governance that had been adopted by settlements from Texas to Oregon. The systematic documentation methods Catherine had developed for exposing the Barrett brothers' crimes were now standard procedures taught to territorial officials, while the community defense strategies that had emerged during the siege were being implemented by frontier settlements facing various threats. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological transformation that had occurred in Copper Ridge, the evolution from a collection of isolated individuals into a genuine community united by shared principles, had proven replicable in diverse circumstances across the frontier. Communities that followed Catherine's example didn't just resist criminal predation. They developed the kind of social cohesion and democratic participation that transformed frontier outposts into permanent foundations for American civilization. The personal cost of this success had been substantial. Catherine had never married, dedicating her life to community development and territorial service rather than family relationships. Her health had been compromised by years of stress, travel, and the psychological burden of carrying so many communities' hopes and fears. At 62, she moved more slowly than she once had, and her hair had turned completely white from experiences that would have broken weaker people. But the sacrifices had produced results that exceeded anything she'd imagined when she first refused to pay the Barrett brothers' protection money. The general store that had been threatened with destruction had become the foundation for a commercial empire that provided employment for dozens of families and served as a model for frontier business development. The community that had nearly been destroyed by criminal predation had evolved into a center of democratic governance that influenced territorial policy throughout the American West. Most importantly, the children who'd hidden in basements during the siege had grown into adults who understood both the costs and the possibilities of democratic participation. They served as teachers, lawyers, business leaders, and territorial officials who carried forward the principles that had been tested during Copper Ridge's darkest hours. Their success demonstrated that individual courage could create generational change, that communities could choose their own character, and that democracy required not just institutions, but citizens willing to defend those institutions against any threat. As Catherine concluded her remarks at the depot dedication, she reflected on the strange journey that had begun with 3 criminals demanding $50 per month and had evolved into a demonstration of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change through collective courage and systematic resistance to evil. The Barrett brothers taught us an important lesson, she said in closing. They showed us that predators will always test communities, that criminals will always seek easy victims, and that evil will always probe for weakness in our democratic institutions. But they also taught us that courage is contagious, that communities can choose principle over safety, and that ordinary people possess the power to stand against extraordinary evil when they finally decide that some things are worth defending regardless of cost. The crowd's applause was prolonged and genuine, reflecting recognition that Catherine Miller's story represented something larger than individual heroism. It demonstrated the possibility that American democracy could flourish even in the harshest circumstances, that communities could govern themselves effectively without sacrificing the independence that characterized frontier culture, and that individual acts of principle could inspire collective action that transformed entire regions. As the ceremony concluded and passengers boarded the afternoon train that would carry news of Copper Ridge's success to communities throughout the American West, Catherine walked slowly back to her store, past buildings that bore the scars and the achievements of 25 years of determined community building. The bullet holes from the Barrett brothers' siege remained visible on several structures, preserved as reminders of what they'd survived and what they'd proved possible. Inside the store, she found the latest batch of letters from communities, seeking guidance, support, or simply inspiration from Copper Ridge's example. Each letter represented people facing their own choices between submission and resistance, safety and principle, individual security and collective courage. Each letter reminded her that the work was never finished, that every generation faced the same fundamental questions about what kind of communities they wanted to build and what they were willing to sacrifice to defend their vision. That evening, as the sun set over mountains that had once seemed like barriers and now appeared to be guardians, Catherine sat on her store's front porch reading letters from places like Montana Territory, where settlers were organizing against land speculators, and Arizona Territory, where mining communities were resisting corporate intimidation tactics. Each letter told a familiar story: ordinary people discovering that they possessed extraordinary power when they finally decided that certain things couldn't be bought, sold, or stolen. The work would continue long after she was gone. The principles that had been tested during the Barrett brothers' siege, that communities could choose their own character, that courage was contagious, and that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil, would face new challenges in each generation. But Catherine had proven that those principles could survive the test, that democracy could flourish even in the harshest circumstances, and that individual courage could inspire collective action that transformed the world. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Copper Ridge, Catherine Miller closed the final letter and prepared for bed, knowing that somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier, other ordinary people were making the same choice she'd made 25 years earlier: to stand for something larger than themselves, to risk everything in defense of principle, and to prove that courage could triumph over corruption when decent people finally decided they'd had enough. The Barrett brothers had come to Copper Ridge seeking easy money from a frightened woman running an isolated store. Instead, they'd encountered something that transformed the American frontier: the discovery that ordinary people possessed the power to create extraordinary communities when they finally learned what they were truly willing to fight for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.